Steve Robitaille was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and later moved to Miami, Florida. He studied journalism at the University of Florida and earned a master's and PhD in English. Dr. Robitaille taught English and media studies for 25 years at Santa Fe College in Gainesville. He's a retired English professor and a multiple Emmy Award-winning documentary producer of films on the arts and on the natural environment. He currently serves as president of Florida Defenders of the Environment. He and his wife Julie live in Gainesville, Florida, and spend their summers in a remote fishing village in Nova Scotia. They have two sons, Jean-Paul and Jordan. Welcome, Steve.
Nice to be here.
You and I ran into each other at the gym one day, and you told me about Ocklawaha, Tales My Father Told Me by John Gottsch, and a documentary that you were working on. And, you know, it came into my mind later, and I had the opportunity to watch it. And it was stunning. So I appreciate you coming on to share this.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, first of all, I guess maybe for those who don't know about the storied history of the Ocklawaha, can you talk to us a little bit about that and how Florida Defenders of the Environment got involved in the project?
Yeah, certainly. In fact, FDE was founded 50 years ago plus by Marjorie Harris Carr to stop the boondoggle that was the Cross Florida Barge Canal. We successfully deauthorized it in around 70, but there still remained two dams, one on the Ocklawaha that created something called the Rodman Reservoir. Right. So we have been working diligently for many years to try to remove that dam and let the Ocklawaha run free. Right. When I saw a year ago that John Gottsch, the composer in residence at the South Florida Symphony, had written a symphony called Ocklawaha Tales My Father Told, I had to find out what this was all about. And he sent me a copy of the score, and it sounded like a John Williams score. I mean, it was just stunning. And so I contacted him and learned that he had been on the river. He was living with his family in South Florida. He was on the river as a very young boy, traveling with his dad, and his dad would tell him these tales. They'd have these fires along the river and camps. And then he went back when he was in college, and the dam was there.
So he had been on the river pre.
Yes, that's a key point. He had seen the river when it was flowing free, and now, as we recreate in the film, you know, he sees this monstrosity and all the dead trees that are looming there, and so he was moved to write a symphony based on this experience, and so he sent me the score, and. The first thing that I had to do was it's kind of what they call a symphonic poem in vignettes, and each of the tales that his father told him is a separate vignette. Right. And so the first challenge was that I knew if it was going to be a PBS show, it had to be like 28 plus minutes. Right. And the symphony runs a tad longer than that. Mm-hmm. So my first challenge as a non-musician was to listen to this many times and work with John to figure out where we could cut this, and he'd be happy with that.
Without offending him.
Without offending them. And so we did that. And then he had made notes for each of the vignettes, each of the tales. And so my job as writer was then to imagine those as these sort of poetic little expressions that represented these moments. And it also was an opportunity to work with Mark Emery, who is an Emmy Award-winning cinematographer, works for BBC, National Geographic, and he is the Ocala filmmaker. I mean, he did this beautiful film on the Silver Springs that featured the original old black Silver Springs boat captains.
Is that right?
It's a stunning piece of work.
Wow.
And then I was able to work with Dan Bram, who had been the editor on the series that I did for the Museum of Natural History, which won a number of Emmys. So I felt like I had the dream team.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be the case. You know, they worked without ego, working with each other to, and it was a unique piece. I mean, I had to look for something that was a comparable. I mean, I thought of like Peter and the Wolf, but that's kind of a symphony with a speaker.
Right.
There's, you know, Chiana, which is all just, you know, this amazing, you know, flow of imagery, and I think it's Philip Glass's score playing against the background. Mm-hmm. But this was totally different. In fact, when we started showing samples of the film to some friends, we realized we couldn't use the word documentary. I was showing it to a scientist friend of mine, and he said, "Well, where's the section on reforestation?" And I said,
"You didn't check all the boxes on a documentary."
No, it's not that kind of film. and so finally, we just dropped the use of that term. Although it's ironic because our dear friend Gregory von Hausch has now invited us to be the closing film at the Fort Lauderdale Film Festival.
Yeah.
And I had to fill out the form to Film Freeway to go through the gauntlet, and I had to choose between short narrative film and documentary, and he told me to choose documentary, which is, you know, just pro forma. It's not really a documentary.
Sounds like you needed another box that just said "Don't ask."
Yeah. And I think that's what's interesting about the film and why maybe it's gotten the reception it did.
You mentioned early on that, you know, the canal was deauthorized. Can you go into a little more, just give me a quick history lesson? I learned in reading it that it was, I guess, Richard Nixon who eventually deauthorized the canal, which I don't know if there's some irony there, but
well, for the best history of this, you have Steve Knoll's Ditch of Dreams.
Okay. It's
an amazing book. Mm-hmm. He's a UF professor, and he wrote a book called Ditch of Dreams. It's all there, and there's, and you know, this thing goes back to the 1800s. I mean, it kept resurrecting itself.
There was literally going to be like a Panama Canal across Florida?
No, they were going to dig, and they proceeded to start digging this ditch across the state. Which would have had, of course, unbelievably bad implications for the ecology of that area. And even as they were beginning the digging for this, and during the war, they said, well, this would be a great place to hide submarines from the Germans. I mean, they always came up with another explanation for this. You know, it was a work project. You know, they were talking about Palatka being this great, river town, these things will come through. But as soon as they started digging it, two things happened. One, the ships they were designing were too big for the canal, and the interstate highway system came on board, rendering the whole project useless.
Right.
So, it got deauthorized, but not before they did two stubs, one from the Gulf and one from, out of the Ocklawaha.
And when did the Rodnam Dam part of this happen?
Yeah, that's when it formed the Rodman Dam, which became a very politically potent and hometown treasure. It became a site for bass fishing tournaments. Mm-hmm. And
for those who don't know, this is over in Putnam County.
Yeah. And so over time, the locals said, don't touch this, leave this here. They called it a kind of a new ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And we've done a lot of analysis over the years and have learned things like, for example, in some of the tournaments, the largest fish are caught in the river and then brought in for measuring and for weighing. Right. But more importantly, this water's being impounded for, a certain kind of bass fishing, when the whole system, see, this is part of what's called the Great Florida Riverway. It starts on the chain of lakes, and of course, uniquely, the St. John's flows north. Mm-hmm. And then it's fed by Silver Springs, which goes into the Silver River, which goes into the Ocklawaha, which goes into the St. John's. Mm-hmm. And once you dam that river, you have all kinds of things happening at both ends. We know, for example, in Silver Springs, that the kind of fish that used to hang out there that would clean that spring like fish could clean your aquarium were no longer. You started having, you can go today and see it's not as, if you went there 50 years ago, how it's so much siltier now. Fish that used to be along that river no longer, and would have to come upriver to, can't make it. Mm-hmm. So I talked with a guy that was baptized on the river. He was 90 when I interviewed him, and old Lester Tootin, I think he's on YouTube, you can find him. And he talks about how he had a church picnic and they needed fish. It's got like the fishes and loaves story. And they went out with his buddy and he caught all these fish and they came in and fried them up and then they ran out. So they got in the boat and went out and got more. And as he pointed out, you can't do that anymore.
Right.
So, the river has definitely been ecologically harmed by this, and that's the reason that we want to restore it.
I have been amazed at the determination of Florida Defenders of the Environment. I've been involved in things in Tallahassee for about 20 years, and I don't think a year goes by where there isn't an effort to free the Ocklawaha.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's sort of the Groundhog Day of environmental projects. And our members, I've been with them now since I did the film on the Swanee in 1981. It's a long time. And, people now, they come up and go, well, anything happening?
Right.
What's new?
Right.
I'm not free to report it yet because it's slowly moving its way forward, but there is stuff happening in Tallahassee as a result of our coalition that could have potentially really positive impacts next year. Mm-hmm. But we're, because the political atmosphere is so charged, as you know, we have to work discreetly, mm-hmm. with the powers that be. What we have noticed is, aside from the, Putnam County constituency, or the commission really, if you go up and down the road, we've done polls and the paradigm has shifted. Mm-hmm. I mean, people realize now that, birding and hiking and canoeing, that kind of ecotourism is going to be far more beneficial, for
a bass tournament every once in a while.
Than an occasional bass tournament,
Yeah.
So we feel, that, things are moving forward and that we will hopefully see some success shortly.
Great. Back to the documentary.
Yeah.
Tell me, kind of put together the process for me. I mean, you've told me about the initial outreach and what you had to do with the score, but how was the whole thing pieced together? I mean, the videography is beautiful, and give me kind of the timeline of the project.
Once we had the script, if you will, and the narrative of the tales, I was the placeholder narrator until my dear friend Bob Knight with the Springs Institute said, "I think I can get you Peter Coyote."
He's not a bad narrator either.
No, which happened. A wonderful last minute thing that happened in the making of the film. But Mark's cinematography is just stunning, but it was tricky because he'd never had his footage used in that way, and Dan, my editor, had never worked on an editing job that had to bring together very, very precisely the music from the symphony, the imagery. I mean, it's so specific that when our young actor swings into and drops into the spring, uh-huh. That's a particular moment in the symphony.
How many takes did it you have to?
Well, it was a somewhat chilly day. He did about 30 swings into the thing. But he's now he lives in Tampa. He's now famous Finn at his school. But it was just this wonderful, many long, 3-way phone conversations.
And then to line it up with the voiceover.
Yeah. So it was a lot of iterations.
How did Bob Knight land Peter Coyote?
Apparently, I never actually. Somehow, he got Peter to do a short piece on the Springs.
Okay.
And I'm not sure exactly how that happened. What I do know is that when Peter Coyote was here, he's an actor, of course, and was here to film Cross Creek. There was a late night charades session with him and my wife and Robert Hutchinson and several other people. So he had some memories of Gainesville. And one of the donors to my film is a dear friend of mine who's a Buddhist. And I'd forgotten until we were working on the bio for Peter, and he called and he said, you got to make two changes. One is you got to eliminate screenplay writer or something, because I never got one bought or something. And the other is you have to add Buddhist priests.
Oh.
So I want to say that he and my friend Jan might have had some connection. That was all long ago and far away, but it was a wonderful Zoom session that we had with him.
And he's of course known in the industry. In addition to being a phenomenal actor, he's a coveted voiceover artist as well.
He's the person that Ken Burns turns to for many of his pieces.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, was all of the video of the river all new video specifically for this piece?
First of all, we couldn't have afforded Mark's footage.
And why do it when you have all this?
There's footage in there that Mark gets for, many hundreds of dollars a second.
Yeah.
That alligator footage and so forth. It was a labor really of love for the river. Because Mark has such a close tie to the river that he was willing to allow us to use his library of footage. But all of the sequences that involve the on the river, the ones we shot with the Seminole Indian and his daughter, of course, all of that is new footage, and we were able to shoot some of it at several ranches that he has access to, that made it easier without having to deal with crowds of people and.
And how did UF get involved? WFT. I know they premiered.
Well, we got involved because we had to figure out how we wanted to distribute this film.
Right.
And my ideal target for this film, the minute that I heard the music, was sort of middle school age kids. I wanted to make a film that I felt if it had been shown 40 years ago in the Palatka area to young kids that age, we wouldn't have had, 40 years of people resisting the restoration.
Right.
So I felt that was a really good and also I aired my first film with them in 1981.
Is that right?
And then subsequently a film on Allen Ginsberg and other films. So we've had a long, wonderful relationship, and there's a tradition of having a presenting station.
Okay.
So they are the presenting station to Florida, and we're now going through the process. It's in the old days, any station could just elect to air what they wanted to. Now a lot of it is controlled at the national level through something called NEDA.
Okay.
And so we're going through that application process now.
To get it out on other...
To get it out all over the country.
PBS stations?
And all over the country.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
One thing that I loved in watching the documentary was the inclusion of the P.K. Young involvement at the end. How did that evolve? Yeah,
that's its own separate piece. When we screen this, for example, in Fort Lauderdale, and we're going to have a screening in Key West, we had one in Ocala at the historic Marion Theater. We just showed, the first half hour, the film itself. But I had wanted, with these middle school kids in mind, to develop a STEAM curriculum that could go with the film.
Nice.
My model for this was actually that when I went down for the premiere of this, the South Florida Symphony, which actually started in Key West and then migrated to Fort Lauderdale, they have a relationship with the schools where they do a STEAM project on coral reef restoration. And when I was down there for the premiere, I went to a high school in the Keys, and they filled this place with these young kids, and they showed, in this case it was a slideshow, not a film, about coral reef restoration, and they had the live symphony on the stage, and they had this wonderful woman that introduced the players, and this is what, an oboe sounds like, and so forth. And I said, how do I do that with this film?
Right.
And I knew that it would be really impossible to have this, the symphony show up in every location.
We have a performing arts center.
But yeah, so I said, well, maybe what I can do is do a making of.
Right.
So, the composer came, the Sabrina Alfonso, who's the Cuban woman conductor of the symphony, came. Their black double bassist, who flew in from the Met for this. She's an astounding musician. Lars Anderson, of course, locally, our historian, and of course, Mark Emery, the filmmaker. And we just, I originally created questions for these PK students to ask, but then I said, well, why don't you create the questions? And they did, and they were brilliant.
They were.
Yeah. And that's now led to my working with their faculty on this curriculum.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Gosh, time is flying by, but can you talk a little bit more about the Florida Defenders of the Environment? You mentioned their formation was 50 years ago now,
right.
I think. Tell me about the genesis of that organization and your involvement in it.
Well, Marjorie Carr, who was married to then the very, very famous author and naturalist Archie Carr, after whom a building is named on the campus, started this operation. She heard about this boondoggle project and started this operation out of her kitchen in Micanopy, mimeograph machines, it was that kind of thing. And that's really been the tradition of FDE, where all of our scientists, our lawyers, are all work pro bono.
Right.
And we only have one, paid, executive director.
Are they all here? Is this an Alachua County
They're all here.
centric?
We used to have an office. Well, we were on Main Street, and then we moved to Melrose, and then when COVID came and whatever, it's actually now migrated to Jim's apartment and my office. And because now with Zooms and all these other situations, we can really operate that way.
Right.
And we have a very, very modest budget. But in the early days, if you look at the early monitors, which is our new newsletter, there were stories on panthers, on manatees, because we were founded the same year as the Friends of the Everglades.
Okay.
We both turned 50 at the same time. And at that time, they were, of course, focused on the Everglades, and we were focused on everything else.
Right. So you were not a one-issue save the Ocklawaha.
No. We had an office in Tallahassee. We had an Appalachia Cola operation, and I got involved on the Swanee. That's why I did that film, because they had a Swanee River Coalition. They were working on phosphate mine issues and just a wide variety of things.
Is that the 7 Ways to Kill the Swanee film? Okay. Yeah. And then you also did a documentary on Archie Carr.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. It was a wonderful opportunity. I met him a couple of weeks before he passed, when he was the world's leading sea turtle expert. And because I'm an English major, I was fascinated by the fact that 2 great novels were immediately directly inspired by his book, The Windward Road.
Oh, is that right?
Peter Matheson read The Windward Road and was inspired to write Far Tortuga, this beautiful poetic work of fiction. And then Russell Hoban wrote Turtle Diary. And if you've seen the film, it's Ben Kingsley and Glenda Jackson.
Okay. I'm going to have to go back.
And it's this couple that wants to let the sea turtles go from the London Aquarium. And there's a scene where one of them goes into this London bookstore and says, "Have you anything on turtles?" And the person answers, "Have you read Carr?" So I went back to Marjorie's house in Micanopy, and there on the shelf was a signed copy of Turtle Diary from Russell Hoban.
What an amazing story.
And so the film was sort of beginning to sort of come together. And he asked, as I said, I saw him a couple of weeks before he passed away, and the funny thing was he was emaciated from cancer, and he looked like a turtle. He looked like a turtle out of his shell. And he had a kind of wry sense of humor, and he said something which I had to think about for a while. He said, "You know, I'm going to be sorry to see me go." And I realized later that what he was saying was that having studied endangered species, he saw himself as one.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, he saw himself as one.
And that's called In Praise of
Archie
Wild
Carr
Florida?
In Praise of Wild Florida.
Yeah.
And the wonderful fruit of that labor was that having, working with Marjorie to bring together all of these writings that were all over the place, she ended up working, I think it was with Yale University Press, for a book published called Archie Carr, A Naturalist in Eden.
Oh.
And it's the collected writings of Archie Carr.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Hey, you're talking about some things that I know people that are watching are going to be dying to view. Where can we find your documentaries?
It's real easy to find. The easiest place to find them is to go to my. I wrote a novel that is sort of yet to be fully launched, but I created a website for it.
Okay.
So it's called steverobitailleauthor.com.
Okay. And you have links to
And at the top it says films.
Oh, great.
And if you link on that, everything from the Swanee to the present is right there.
Tell me, what are the hot topics right now for Florida defenders of the environment? Obviously, the Ocklawaha is always
Yeah,
on
well,
your
as a
mind.
result of these very recent happenings, which hopefully I can talk more about shortly,
Okay.
we've kicked into a different gear research-wise to prepare for what might be happening in the next year. So there's a lot of activity still on that front. We have a very brilliant young new member of our executive committee who is a PhD student at UF, who has pretty much single-handedly, he's kind of like a young Marjorie Carr, is trying to stop something called the Pioneer Exchange down at Spruce Creek, south of us. And so we have been contributing to that both financially and with legal consultation. He's actually been serving as his own kind of representative on the project. So that's now an appeal. I won't go into the details of that, but okay. So that's an interesting project. It's sort of outside of our immediate area, which is something we haven't done for a while. Right. And of course, we're working on the film project, and ultimately beyond that will be the curriculum. So that's going to be. We're
about out of time, but it sounds like you haven't slowed down much in your recent retirement.
No, I wouldn't have probably made another film unless this extraordinary piece of music had come into my life.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for coming in. All of these stories are just fascinating, and I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Good to see you.
You too.